I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Kara Githens.
This is the Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Good morning, this is Steve.
Hello, this is Kara.
And we'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Innkeepers podcast. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk about the issues of cross-cultural stress and the transition that your global workers face when they are moving into a new culture. And it's pretty fascinating to look at some of these things that they're going to go through. And it's really going to be helpful especially if you're in the missions pastor, mission care, and it can really give you some insight and some clues as to how to communicate with your missionary, especially in their first year or 2 years of ministry.
Yeah, and if you are the missionary yourself living through a cross-cultural transition, it sometimes can be comforting to know what to expect in a transition, or maybe you're in the middle of something and you feel like maybe you shouldn't feel that way because, it's really not that hard. Why is it that I'm struggling so much? And just give yourself some grace that transitions take time, and there are some just unique stressors that you are facing as part of adjusting to another culture. Whether you're entering a new culture as a missionary, or whether you're returning to your quote-unquote home culture, you and your kids are experiencing culture shock.
Yeah.
Or culture stress, I should say.
Yeah. You'll hear both terms, culture shock, culture stress, and we may use them interchangeably. Some people have a preference one over the other. But
yeah, I think some people like to define shock more as that, like the abrupt feeling that you get when you first arrive somewhere, and the stress is that more prolonged, like a year, 2 years in, you're still feeling the pressures of the adjustment. And that feels more like stress.
Yeah. I feel like, in my case, something that I've learned over the years, and that isn't just going cross-culturally, but just as I've transitioned from job to job or different geographic place to different geographic place, is that I need to give myself a year to learn the rhythms and the cycles and the routines of the new place, because everything changes. When you change location, even in the States, if you're moving from one place to another, you're going to get a whole new rhythm of routine, the routines and everything. And so you have to give yourself the grace to live through that first year especially.
Yeah. So let's just start by defining what is cross-cultural stress.
Okay.
I would say that is the stress that you experience when adjusting to a different culture and a way of life. So it's that pressure that you feel from... Yeah. Everything is done differently.
Yeah. All of a sudden, you're in a new place, and it's like, whoa, this, as we would often say, we're not in Kansas anymore. So that line from The Wizard of Oz is kind of repeated by missionaries a lot. But you realize, hey, I'm in a new place. In 1995, we moved to Slovakia just actually the 1st of December. So we were there just before... the Christmas, what we would consider the Christmas holiday. And, you have to learn the routines. And there were some things. We had coworkers who were there, and they kind of helped us get settled and get started. But then they left almost immediately to have Christmas in the States. This had been planned. And anyway, they got us kind of settled, and they got us connected with people that could help us. But then Christmas came, and we didn't know what an extended holiday Christmas was, because you have a Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, you have the day after Christmas, and it's they're all connected to religious events, religious church services, and so on. And we didn't know about all of the shopping that you would have to do before, because the stores, the little grocery stores in your village would shut down probably on Christmas Eve, that was your last chance, even then, to buy anything that you needed. And the stuff you realized you needed, everyone had bought already.
And how long was everything shut?
Well, depending on when Christmas fell and stuff, it'd be maybe 5 days or so. The little stores would close down. And that was then followed by almost 2 weeks of what they call inventory. And inventory, we came to learn, was pretty much an excuse to close your little shop, and take some time off. And because you'd have these little tobacco stands and small grocery stores that would close for 2 weeks for inventory. And all of a sudden, you didn't have the stuff you needed, and your little store closed. And it was like, oh my.
So you had just arrived, and here you were thinking you could figure out how to do Christmas together there, and all of a sudden you realized you were in a new place, and you did not know how to do Christmas in this new country.
Well, and then when you need butter, flour, whipping cream, and those kinds of things, some of just the basics, and my wife can really get by on very little, and she can make a lot of great things, but when she doesn't have those basic things, it gets hard to create the things that she was planning on making. So.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so that's a great image of a cultural stress event that was part of your transition.
Yeah. Well, Kara, you've lived in Brazil, but you also spent some time in Italy. Was there something in Italy that kind of caught you off guard?
Yeah, so I went to Italy as a young adult to do an internship there. I lived there for 6 months with an Italian family. So I was very much immersed in the culture. There was no one to speak English with. I had to learn Italian, and I had to live life how they live life. So it's a really amazing way to learn a culture and a language. But it's also a bit difficult at times because you have to live by their routines and their schedules, and you don't even set like times to eat. And this is one of the stressors that I faced was at least specifically the family I lived with and the way their rhythms of culture. And it is very Italian that you eat a pretty light breakfast, coffee and maybe a pastry or some bread. And then lunch isn't until closer to 1. And then lunch is more of pasta or a light kind of lunch. And then the biggest meal of the day is at dinner. And I'm used to having a bigger breakfast and eating lunch earlier and dinner being a little lighter or about the same as lunch. And here I was just hungry all the time because I was like, when are we going to eat? Because I'm not a coffee drinker and I don't want just a little piece of bread. I want some protein, whatever. So my cultural expectation and that I could cook my own food and do my own thing, even that was taken away from me. And it took a little bit of conversation with the family trying to negotiate. Well, maybe could I have an egg for breakfast? Or maybe could I have a little something more? And that just caught me by surprise. Here was jet-lagged and tired and like my rhythms of how am I even going to feed myself were changed. And don't get me wrong, the Italian food was amazing. And we had the 5-course meals and the meals that lasted 3 hours. And I ate plenty. But it was just something that caught me by surprise.
Yeah. I think that reminds me, too. The Slovaks tend to have a light breakfast, a big lunch, and then a very light dinner. Because the way it was set up, especially going back years, and so think of communism, people working in factories, and the state paid for your lunch.
Oh, wow.
So you would go, you'd have your breakfast, which was probably just coffee and a roll, and then you would go to lunch, and they had a buffet or a cafeteria in the place where you worked, and that was your big meal. And that was paid for through your work. You didn't pay for that. And then you'd go home and you'd catch the bus, you'd go home, whatever. And in the evening, then you would just have probably some sliced meat and some cheese and some bread. And that was dinner. And so especially when we would have summer teams and they would have this light breakfast, a big lunch, and then they'd be busy all afternoon doing stuff, and they'd come back exhausted and starving, and they were given almost nothing for dinner. It was, we often had to figure out how to get them extra food.
So even a short-term team can maybe experience a little taste of that culture shock.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be nearly as,
no.
when you spend 6 months, a year, 2 years, a lifetime in another culture, and eventually you adjust if you've been there. And that's what we want to talk about, is that these stressors can be hard, especially in the first couple of years. And some things are long-term stressors that you learn to live with. Standing in lines.
Yeah.
I think most everyone who works around the world, the lines and efficiency of how to do things, if you're used to it one way and it doesn't work that way in the country you're in, it can be very stressful. So, but some things you learn to live with, and some things you get used to and you take on as your own. Like, I grew up in Brazil with eating a big lunch, and I always thought that was great. And, so a lot of things revolve around food, around time, around language use, and so just habits of living. Yeah. And how traffic, all these kinds of things.
How traffic flows or doesn't flow.
Yeah. So, I mean, missionaries, if you sit down with someone who has lived cross-culturally, they could tell you so many stories of just how life is done differently. And that is part of the stressors of a cross-cultural transition.
Yeah. And there is what we call the transition curve. And so let's talk a little bit about that. And so as you think about someone working cross-culturally, or thinking about yourself, and especially if you're in a new place, we're going to just talk through this a little bit and hopefully encourage you as you communicate, and encourage you as you feel different things, like, oh, I'm not so weird after all. This isn't just me. This happens to people around the world. So when we talk about the transition curve, Kara, what's the shape of the curve?
So it looks kind of like a U. And imagine that you have a U in front of you. And just to note, we will be putting this transition curve model in our show notes and some other material that we're going to reference here today. So you can go download that and take a look at it as we're talking about it if you'd like. So this transition curve was put together by Marion Dickey in 2001, and it's taken from the book Transitions by Bridges and The Change Cycle by Brock and Salerno.
Kara, does this model begin with your arrival in the new place?
So no, it actually doesn't. So this U shape is imagine on the left side of it is the word endings. So saying goodbyes and saying the closure that happens in one culture and place, and all the way to the other side of the U on the right-hand side is going to be your new beginnings and your adjustment, more or less fully to the next culture and place.
Can you just mention why the endings are so important and why your leaving is significant as you begin this transition?
So when you don't leave well, it makes it, you end up carrying a lot of baggage of that place, and maybe some bitterness or anger or unforgiveness or relationships that didn't get resolved can be a piece of the puzzle, or even just the goodbyes that didn't happen. I know a lot of people in the mess of this COVID ended up with some abrupt leavings and goodbyes from places of ministry, and that if you sit down with some people who've been through an abrupt transition, sometimes that goodbye didn't happen, and the social distancing. A lot of people experience the inability to say goodbye, so that sometimes makes it take longer to be able to process and to unpack the importance of that place that you left. So as we speak about endings, part of that process is that we emotionally begin to disengage, or we begin to talk about, maybe it wasn't that great anyways, and we talk about feeling maybe disappointment and that loss, or sometimes denying that it really does hurt to say goodbye. And then there's, on the positive side, there's celebrations and some contentment maybe in some good work that was done, and maybe some time to say thank you and express gratitude for what went well in this season. And so endings are kind of messy.
Yeah. And I think it's important to realize that your transition curve happens as you, let's say you leave your home country to your country of service, and then from your country of service back to your home country. It's going to happen both directions.
Yes. So we talk about reentry,
Yeah.
cultural stress and shock and transition. They're all a reality.
Yeah.
And for some, I would say for TCKs, MKs, the reentry culture shock is usually more severe and difficult than the transition to the country of service.
Yeah. And also thinking about someone perhaps that's just finished raising their support, they've met their goals, they're making plans to move, and the celebration piece is very important for them, to celebrate the work that they've done, celebrate with family and friends about the new chapter ahead of them, and to send them off in a good way.
Yeah. So it's good to be intentional and recognize that the emotions are mixed. There's some joy in looking forward to the new things and the new life that God has for you in another country. And there's some really hard things to say goodbye and sell belongings, and for kids to, think about that place or that home or that school or whatever it was that they're really going to miss, and their friends. And so that's all part of endings. And then you kind of go, usually you've been on a plane and you've arrived somewhere else, and you kind of hit this neutral zone, which is, imagine the bottom of the U of the transition. And you arrive and you kind of feel a little empty, a little confused, like I don't know where I fit in anymore. And some of these things that we talked about of this being surprised at how everybody celebrates their holidays, or being surprised at, what's another stressor that you've experienced in the midst of transition?
I think about the word identity, because you left your home country with probably some pretty defined roles and pretty defined, like, this is who I am and this is what I do. And then you show up in your place of service, and all of a sudden it's going to take some time to put those pieces together. And if maybe, different for different people, but it's going to take some time to go, oh, who am I? How do I fit? Where do I fit? How does my family fit in with all the other families here? And this kind of thing. So that's that certainly contributes to the chaotic feeling.
Yeah, and often feelings of anxiety of, will I fit in? Will this work out? Will our family, how's the schooling going to go for my kids? There's a lot of mixed feelings there. But there's also anticipation and discovery. And some people really flourish at finding out about the new place and meeting new friends. And, your personality and how you're wired and all that will play into this as well. Yeah. And then as time goes on, and one thing is key to any transition is to give yourself permission to take time. This transition curve or adjustment to another culture takes anywhere from a year to 2 years for most people.
All right. Okay, so people shouldn't be surprised, like, oh, I've been here 6 months and I don't have all this figured out yet.
No, in fact, I would say 6 months for some people is the hardest time.
Okay.
And for some people, it's like 3 months in. They realize, whoa, I'm here, and I've committed to staying here. I've got to figure this out. Yeah. Can be the hard spot. But either way, it usually takes people a year to 2 years to feel like they fully created that space, those roles, their identity begins to shift a little bit to absorb this new culture in place. So then, as things get a little better and we move towards this other side of the U where there's new beginnings and you're kind of coming out of this valley, there's some sense of reorientation and feelings of motivation of like, okay, we can do this. This is, we have a new place and new visions and new ministry, and we've learned some of the ways life works, in this last year.
Right.
And I can begin to feel like I can do this.
Right. Now, a lot of times on this bottom part of the U, you might say, That's when people are like, oh, that's the whole stress word pops up. How can I do this? Can I go through this? And so, and that's when it's important to know and to realize that you are susceptible maybe to a lot of discouragement or frustration, and you're like, because often when you arrive, it's sort of the euphoric, this culture is great, this is fun, I'm learning new things, and then all of a sudden the culture sort of slaps you in the face, and it's like, this isn't fun anymore, I'm not learning any new things, I'm not sure I want to stay here. And
I'm exhausted,
I don't understand these people, I can't speak to anyone, I can't make myself understood. I mean, that alone, if you're moving somewhere where language is an issue, just learning to communicate can be such a frustration. Like, I used to be competent, I used to know how to say things, and now I can't.
Yeah, and that language learning piece is probably a significant stressor that if you've never learned another language fluently in another language and culture, it may come as a surprise of how challenging it can be. And I have to be honest, when I moved to Italy as a young adult, I was already fluent in Portuguese. I had learned Portuguese as a child. Spoke English in our home, but when I was 3, I learned Portuguese. So I don't remember learning Portuguese. Yeah. It just, I spoke it because it was everywhere. Anyways, so I was bilingual, but I had never experienced that adult process of learning another language. So I moved to Italy, and Portuguese is fairly similar to Italian. And here I was living with an Italian family. Right. And I thought I could figure out the language even faster than I did, and I made a lot of dumb mistakes, and I felt stupid a lot, and sometimes I got laughed at for saying a word that in Portuguese meant this, that I thought, okay, this must be the word in Italian too, and instead it meant something completely different, and they're just literally laughing in my face. Yeah. So you just get exhausted at this thought of, am I ever really going to be able to be fully understood, or am I ever going to get my mouth to make these sounds and not look and feel stupid? So there's a lot of exhaustion that happens in learning, and your brain is just mentally tired all the time. It's
learning Slovak was, the Slavic languages have an excess of consonants. They have taken all the consonants and they just use them all the time. Then we moved 2 hours away to Budapest, and they have an excess of vowels. They have so many vowels of the way they use their vowels, and so it's just kind of hilarious to have spent all this time learning a language that can be very harsh sounding, and then you move to Hungary, and you're like, whoa, what are these people doing with these words? Anyway, so 2 very complete different experiences there.
Yeah, so a missionary may have gone from one language to another language and never fully absorbed or learned any language completely, or they're still learning, and it takes years. Yeah, I mean, I know my parents spent 27 years in Brazil, and they were fully fluent, but there were still they still had an accent after 27 years. Yeah, people knew they were American. Okay, and so and you just have to have grace with yourself. Right. And give yourself permission, and that's part of transition, and that's part of the sometimes the feeling frustrated and feeling confused of, am I ever going to really be able to do this? Yeah. And you are normal if you think that.
Yeah. Just thinking about stress again, and thinking about so outside pressure reacting on your marriage and your family, and how significant it is before you move to a new culture to ask God to work on family and marriage issues, and really so that, because when you move cross-culturally, nothing gets easier. The stress, marriage stress gets more intense, family stress gets more intense. And so to seriously take that inventory with God. God, what's important? What do you want to do in our lives before we make this transition, so that when you get in this new place, the stress doesn't just crush you?
Yeah. And stress is normal. All of us experience it.
Yeah.
Healthy, it can even be helpful. If we've studied and realized that when people take tests, if they don't have any level of stress, they actually perform more poorly on testing if they don't feel any bit of like that pressure to perform and do well. So stress can actually be a good thing. It's when it's a lot of stress, which is what missionaries experience, a compounding of layers of stress.
Yeah.
So some of these stresses can motivate us to work on our marriages or to pay attention to what's happening with our kids, or to be more on the alert for what do I need to do to learn this language, or how do I, stay focused. But it's when it keeps getting compounded that sometimes it can be incapacitating to a person.
Okay. So our missionary family has said their goodbyes. They've relocated to their new place. They've kind of processed some of these feelings of trying to find their footing and who am I, how do I fit? And now they start coming out on the other side. And I think studies show that most people come out and do really well. Yes,
adjustment can, if you allow yourself to stay in the process of transition and hang in there. Some people, for whatever reason, 6 months in, things really didn't go as planned, and they end up leaving the field. That sometimes can be pretty damaging to themselves and their perception of missions, because they've left at the low point.
Okay.
Because it just takes time. It takes a year to 2 years to fully adjust to a new culture. And when you leave in that place of, this is so hard, I don't think I can do it. And sometimes for very legitimate reasons. I'm not knocking on anyone who ended up making that decision, but they have to recognize that they didn't fully go through the transition experience and maybe come out on the other side. If they had hung in there a little longer, it may have come. But maybe something, work relationships, crisis, war. There are reasons people leave the field unexpectedly. Yeah. And it creates a whole nother kind of bag of issues to work through.
Yeah, I know of a couple that arrived in a cross-cultural setting, and they got there and realized that everything, what they felt like everything they had been told was not true, and they literally just couldn't make the adjustments and said, no, we can't do this. And I feel for them. I feel for people that end up in those kind of situations, because no one wants to be there. No one wants to be in a situation where you aren't doing what you had dreamed about doing.
Yes. Yeah, so it's a real thing for anyone who lives cross-culturally and moves between cultures. The transition is hard, both going to the country of service and returning to your sending country. So I think sometimes the expectation is that, it'll be easy when we come back. Even if you've had a hard experience going, or maybe it was a good experience going, and you lived there for years and years, and you coming back, and you idealize what you left most often, the transition back is also going to be challenging.
So, Kara, as our missionary family, our global worker family is getting adjusted into their new place, and they're starting to learn their new routines, and, it just kind of, time goes by, and they're like, they're able to celebrate different things. The whole issue of cross-cultural stress, it doesn't go away. It's still there, but it can be managed. It's not something that's going to, ruin your life, but it does have to be managed, but it can be managed.
Yes, it definitely can be managed. And there's an article that was put out in EMQ back in 1991, so it's an oldie but a goodie, by Kelly and Michelle O'Donnell. They wrote an article called "Stress Can Be Managed." We will also put it in our notes. But this article references what are some of the stressors that missionaries face. What are the most common stressors? And Steve, would you mind sharing with us what are the most common stressors?
Well, in the article they reference your relationship with other missionaries, which in most lists that is the first thing. There's your ongoing cultural adjustments. You have raising your kids in a new culture, which is challenging because you have education decisions and you transportation. There's just all kinds of things that impact your kids. Is there anyone to play with? Do you feel safe? Do you feel safe where you live? And so on. And then personally, there can be issues in your marriage. There can be financial issues, especially if you're under-supported or there's unexpected expenses or things like that, that can create a huge stress there. And then oftentimes people just feel lonely. Do people know about me? Do they remember me? Do they care about me?
Yeah. And have I been able to make new friends in the new culture and learn the language enough to be accepted and connected and be known? Yeah. So those are some of the kind of perennial issues of stress in missions. But there can be a lot of other different stressors unique to you and your situation. There's been created what's called this CHOPS model, which is kind of an inventory for stress that is referenced in this article. We're going to walk through that. What are the different areas of stressors? And I'd encourage you to kind of take inventory of your own life and what are the areas where I'm experiencing stress. And then when you know where the stress points are, then you can be more focused in getting help in those areas or finding resources or finding books or materials that can help educate you and maybe to take steps towards managing that stress.
Yeah. And in the world we live in now, there's a huge amount of resources available online. And I go back to one of our interviews with Global Trellis and Amy, and she has a lot of resources. There are Barnabas International and so on. There's just a lot of resources available online. So if you're feeling like, oh, I need some help in this area, and you're not in a place where you can access maybe face-to-face with someone, you can certainly find some help in an online resource.
Yeah, and I would encourage you even to go through our podcasts and see maybe in season 1 or earlier in season 2, is there something there that someone spoke about an area of stress? Because we, in our podcast, are really trying to touch on all these different areas that we know are part of the reality of the missionary life.
So in this CHOPS model, just imagine, it's spelled with CHOPPSS. So the first area is cultural stress. So, Kara, if someone's going to inventory themselves in cultural stress, what are some of the questions they're going to be asking?
So, how is your language learning going? How are you doing at adjusting to the new culture? What ways are you getting your needs met and adapting to the new language and culture? How is that going for you?
Right. Are you functioning? How kind of, how am I functioning? If you rated yourself on a 1 to 10 scale, am I, do I know how to pay my bills? Do I know how to shop? Can I get my car fixed? Can I get my kids to school? Do I know what my choices are for certain things? And sometimes
all in a new language.
Yeah, all in a new language.
So this is the cultural stress, that piece of the language and the way in which, the manner in which things are done can be completely upside down from the way you knew in your previous culture.
Oh, yeah. I think one of the things that I hear so often and that we had some experience with is getting paperwork renewed, visas and residency papers and car inspections and things like that. If you live in the States, you're pretty used to a DMV situation where you're going to go into the motor vehicles and probably take a number and take a seat, pre-COVID, of course, and you're just going to wait. You're going to wait your turn. We would go into an office in Slovakia. Often I would never go by myself. I was always accompanied by a Slovak. And you just waited in a room, and behind the door was someone that you needed to talk to. And whenever the door opened, everyone in the room got up and ran to the door.
Oh, my.
And then you never knew who was going to get through the door to talk to this person. Usually it was someone they knew or da-da-da. And it's like, what? I don't.
I'm never going to make it in.
You feel like the man at the pool of Bethesda. Like, I'm never going to get in that water, or I'm never going to get behind that door to talk to that person. And that was
stressful.
Yeah, I'd spend a whole day there and probably never get anything done. Anyway, yeah, that was stressful.
So, inventory, how's that going for you and where you are, and what do resources might you need, or someone, maybe a cultural mentor, or continuing to work on language studies, like all those things can help improve in these areas so that you don't feel so stressed and overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So the next letter in this acronym, CHOPS, H, for human stress.
Okay.
So what does that entail?
So some of these inventory questions you can ask yourself: how is it going with my team? What are my relationships like? Are there areas of conflict we need to identify and address? And how are we going to do that? How are my relationships within the culture that I'm living? Do I feel like I'm getting along? Do I feel like, as well as I can anyway, am I being received? How is my family doing? Is everyone thriving? Are they doing okay? Is there someone in my family that's just really not doing well? And try to identify what's going on there.
Yeah. So all the interpersonal kind of relationships and you and your family are dealing with, kind of take inventory there. For the next letter, O, for organizational stress, that means how's your job satisfaction? Some of this is missions policies, or kind of the hoops that you need to jump through in that culture, maybe to set up your organization, or to, how is the leadership structure and style and work hours and expectations? How is all that going for you?
Mm-hmm. Then as we move along, you have the area of physical stress. How am I doing? Am I well? Is everyone in my family well? As you are on the field and you're celebrating a birthday or a special event and realize, oh, I'm getting older. How am I doing with that? Am I okay with that? Am I able to do my job? Is there any change there? And some people move to dramatically different climates or environments. And interesting, moving from the Pacific Northwest to Europe, the environmental change was actually very small. It's so similar, but we have friends in very tropical places, and they deal with heat and humidity all the time, and that's a huge stress.
Yeah, and it can be a positive stress or a negative stress. I personally loved having tropical Christmas. We spent Christmas in the swimming pool, and I loved it, and I still struggle as a TCK sometimes thinking, what, we are expecting, we want snow's fun, but I really miss the heat of summer, and that being at Christmas time. So, but that's for maybe an adult a missionary who goes over, and I don't know specifically what it was like for my parents, but maybe that was a little bit challenging, or I miss having a white Christmas, or, cozying up by the fire for Christmas. So even just those kinds of things, the expectations around what the climate and holidays and all that stuff can kind of feel like a stressor. And just the plain heat. If you're not used to heat and you live somewhere where it's been a lot colder, or perhaps vice versa, maybe you live somewhere where it's warmer and you move to, Russia, and it is a lot colder there, and you weren't used to that, and all the layers, and just those climate changes. That's a real thing. It's a real stress. Or do I know how to drive in the snow? I now live on the mountain, and I'm still learning how to drive in the snow, because this tropical girl at heart,
I know,
is still adjusting.
We just got an email from some friends that have relocated back to their place of service, and he's like, it was 110 in the shade today, and sorry, I just can't imagine 110 in the shade and blowing sand and dust everywhere all the time.
So those are realities that you're facing. So how are you managing those, and what can you do to thrive in those situations as best as you can?
Yeah. A lot of these things are outward things, but Kara, let's talk about psychological stress, things that maybe people aren't seeing.
Yeah, so that's the next letter here in the CHOPS model, is identifying what are the things that maybe are unresolved past hurts in your life, some inner conflicts that you're dealing with, some anxiety, depression, maybe some boredom, maybe some, or maybe feeling like you're overworked and you just the mental stress and strain. And so kind of taking inventory of what in my life, in my inner life, how am I doing? Are all these other physical and environmental stressors creating a depression or exhaustion or or tension? I know that like when I'm extra tired, I'm extra antsy and unkind sometimes to my spouse. So is one stress creating stress in the another? I mean, we're whole people.
Right.
So if I had to deal with 110 degree heat and sand blowing in my house all the time, like I might not be as kind interpersonally, so just kind of, you're dealing with real life situations, and we are whole people, and how we feel inwardly affects how we act outwardly, and what's happening on the outside, physically, with language, with culture, all these things affect us in pretty deep ways.
Right. And of course we know the life of a cross-cultural worker is stress-free when it comes to money and housing and retirement and support staff to get things done. Sorry, that was just a joke, because I have met very few people in the missions world who don't have issues about money, who don't run into housing issues, who maybe haven't had wise counsel or good advice on how to plan for retirement. And most cross-cultural workers are way overworked because they're doing the work of 2 or 3 or 4 people.
Yeah. So that's the next letter in the S for CHOPS. The first S is support stress. Like what are those stressors that Steve just spoke about that are, maybe take inventory? Is one of those kind of just a blaring, blinking red light that needs attention? Yeah. And then the last letter here is spiritual stress. And they're going with an acronym here, but I would say in some ways, as we've spoken about in like praying for your missionary in that episode we talked with Doug Hazen, that praying for our missionaries and caring for our missionaries, being proactive in caring for their spiritual health, can be the difference in all of this. Right. So spiritual stress, are you able to maintain an active and alive devotional life? And what is the spiritual warfare like? And how are you handling temptations? Are you able to flee from temptations, or are you succumbing to it because of you're trying to maybe band-aid some of these hard things in your life with some bad habits?
So as we kind of look back on this CHOPS model, the CHOPPSS, and the last one, the spiritual stress, that is so significant in the life of the missionary. And if you haven't listened to the episode where we did interview Doug Hazen and praying for your missionary, I would encourage you to go find that episode and listen to that, because he talks about devotional life, he talks about spiritual warfare, he talks about temptation, he talks about people praying for you. And it is so significant that when you're in a hard place and a hard situation, that you can look back and say, God has put me here. This is my call, and I'm convinced in my heart of hearts that the reason I'm here is because God has called me here. Because if you aren't able to come back to that, you find yourself on you could say, sandy soil, not the solid rock.
Yeah, and studies have shown that the number one factor for resiliency in a missionary life is that conviction of their call and being able to stay rooted and grounded in Christ in the midst of what are real hard life circumstances. And, I also want to mention that as much as there is a lot of stress and sometimes overwhelmingly amount of stress, there can be a lot of joy.
Yeah.
A lot of just there's an amazing privilege and satisfaction in knowing you're doing what God has created you to do, has designed you to do, and invited you to do with Him. And His grace is sufficient even for some of these really hard things and these stressors that are a part of anyone's life. I mean, whether you're living cross-culturally or not, you have stress in your life.
Yeah.
And they probably fall underneath these categories. And we all can choose to trust Jesus in whatever circumstance we're in and find joy with Jesus.
Yeah. Reading through the life of the Apostle Paul had a lot of stress. I mean, I was just reading the other day where he was stoned and drug out of the city and stoned and left for dead. And he gets up and joins his friends, and he doesn't say, "Oh, that's it. I can't do this anymore. God hasn't called me to this." He goes right back to it, and he just continues in the ministry because he had that. He could look back. He had such an amazing call on his life.
Yeah.
He couldn't deny that, but at the same time, he and that grounded him, and that gave him this is what I've been called to do. This is what I'm going to do, and life is hard. I'm just going to keep going.
And he knew it was worth it. He had this picture in his mind that he knew Christ was worth it.
Yeah.
And that Christ had already sacrificed everything and suffered everything far more than he had.
That's right.
And so he could hang in there and know that Christ was with him in it. We're not left alone to struggle through these things. And I think that we need to be aware of what stressors are in the missionary life, and we need to be aware of how transitions can be messy and kind of challenging. And we also need to remember that this is all for an amazing reason.
Yeah.
We are about reaching people for Christ, and we are about God is doing something in us and through us for His glory.
Yeah.
And it's worth it. And it's also, God has given us some great resources and tools so that you can not burn out on the field.
Right.
And not kind of be so overwhelmed that you're incapacitated. And we don't want that. We're not saying grin and bear it and pray harder and you're going to make it.
Yeah.
Reach out for help.
Yeah.
There's support out there. Use the resources that we're providing and others are providing out there. And I know that God can carry you through whatever transition you're in.
Yeah, God at one point reminded Paul that His grace was sufficient, and Paul needed to be reminded about that too. And there are times where we're going to have to just cry out to God and have Him, just ask Him to pour out that grace in our lives and give us the ability to walk through the situation, because it would not, in ourselves, it would not be possible. But God is sufficient. His grace is sufficient, and He has called you. He will sustain you.
He will equip you.
And it's just amazing to look back and say, "Wow, God carried me through that situation."
Yes, and if you are a friend or a family member or someone who's supporting someone on the field, maybe you can reach out to them, and you can be a person of blessing in the life of someone who's really struggling with some cross-cultural stress right now.
Yeah, and as you think about your missionaries, and especially those that are beginning a transition, as you pray for them, you can pull up this transition curve model, and you can have a pretty good idea of how to pray for them or how to write them an encouraging email as they are transitioning, going through this, the saying goodbye, embracing the new experiences, having probably some tough new experiences, but then as they find their feet and continue to make their way in the new culture. This transition curve model is just a great prayer tool as you pray for missionaries.
Yes, and don't remember, TCKs, MKs are also going through this, especially when they come back to the U.S. In my personal experience, that was definitely the hardest transition that I went through. And so be on the lookout for those TCKs that maybe are coming to the U.S. Summertime is definitely the time where a lot of them are coming back and getting ready to start college. So if you run into one, know that they are going through transition, and it is a hard, sticky time, and you can be a friend.
Yeah, and maybe that just involves asking them some simple questions. How are you doing? What's the hardest thing for you that you're going through right now? How can I help you?
Well, we hope that this episode on cross-cultural stress and transition is a blessing to you and to those you're supporting, and gives you some great tools and a greater understanding of how to reach out to your missionary, or how you can thrive in the midst of some hard situations.
Right. And as always, please communicate with us at Sanctuary Inn, and you can email Kara at sanctuaryinn.org or myself, Steve at sanctuaryinn.org, and there's resources on our website and links to other websites that have tremendous resources as well.
Thanks for joining us.
And we hope you appreciate and enjoy this episode of the Innkeepers podcast. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers for kingdom purposes. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, and maybe you were prompted to pass this along to someone you know that will benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Kara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy schedules to help us learn more about missionary care.
We also want to thank Tim Downing for the music that he wrote and performed specifically for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can learn more about him and his work at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos and is produced by Tim Cowley of Cowley Visuals. If you have media needs, including film, photography, or audio, you can reach Tim at cowleyvisuals.com.
Our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, Kara's amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website and learn more about the ministry of Sanctuary Inn at sanctuaryinn.org. Thank you again for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.
See you next time.